Hi, I'm Jordan Moss. I'm a senior hard surface artist at Creative Assembly and a previous weapon artist at Splash Damage. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over Substance Painter and how to achieve high quality bake results using all of the tools within Painter. That includes cages, match by mesh name, and all kinds of things like ignore back faces. So let's get started with this. So with this mesh here, this is kind of the final result. This is a Spyderco Velaton, one of my projects that I just finished. I encountered some errors to do with baking here, but the primary intention of this is just kind of to show you guys using a final asset of how to achieve some of the results that I'm getting here, or if not better. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into 3ds Max. You can use your app of choice, Blender, Maya. Just beware of the downsides to some of these applications. A lot of them have issues to do with scaling and up axis and all that kind of stuff. 3ds Max is no exception of that. 3ds Max has a lot of issues to do with Z up and poser flips and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to look at the low poly here and some of the naming. So the naming I'm using here is the match by mesh name feature that Substance Painter provides. The match by mesh name feature is essentially an ability to explode bake the mesh down into primary parts. So the baker looks at pieces like this, and it'll bake that one part, and it'll bake this other part, and it just prevents cage intersections and bake overlaps and all that kind of fun stuff. So you do it for your own sanity, although naming 1,000 objects in a scene can be quite tricky. It's generally your friend. So everything named with an underscore low is treated as the low poly, and everything with a suffix underscore high is treated as the high poly. And I'm going to cover one other thing, which is the ignore back facing, which is underscore Ignorebf. So you've still got the high here, underscore high, because it is still going to bake down to the high from the high poly, underscore Ignorebf. So ignoring back facing is something that's done in order to make sure that you don't get issues with floaters. So specifically parts like this that are floating off the high poly. When you bake down those to a low poly, you tend to end up with shadows in the ambient occlusion and just general issues. So Ignorebf basically targets these parts of the mesh to say, don't cast shadows onto this high poly, because why would you do that? And so you get way better results from the ambient occlusion, the curvature, and all that kind of fun stuff. So in this scene as well, I've assigned material colors to the high poly because I want to separate all the parts into material IDs, and I'm going to cover IDs as well. So IDs in Painter, if I go into the big parameters just to show you the ID, you have vertex color, which is primarily something you get from Zbrush, or you can assign vertex color in 3ds Max or Maya or whatever you want to use. But generally, vertex color is only for polypaint data. Material color, that comes in with the FBX. So as long as you're assigning it with the legacy material, it'll work. File ID, which is, as it states down there at the bottom, which it doesn't state down the bottom, sorry. File ID essentially is the ID of the meshes. So if you've got multiple high polys in the scene, it'll use the file ID. And mesh ID polygroup. So you can set mesh IDs in 3ds Max. I can't remember in Maya if you can set mesh IDs, but polygroups is essentially just different parts of the high poly. So every part that isn't part of itself, so these are all separate, they'll be given a different color based upon hue. So the only reason I'm using defined color here is because sometimes you change something and you need to rebake, and what Painter will do, which isn't too great if you've got it on mesh ID polygroup or hue shift and random, is it'll assign a new color to a different part. So if you've already started texturing and you've gone through everything and you change this and you bake again, you end up with different ID colors for every single part, and then you have to reassign using the picker tool, which can be quite a headache. So if you set your ID colors you can do that pretty quickly. So I use the assembly tool, which was a tool that was just released actually for 3ds Max. So I can't remember the guy's name. I will quickly look because I do want to give props to the guy who made it. It's Andrew Avakin. So he's also a guy who does kit bash sets, I believe. But this is amazing tool for 3ds Max. I believe he uses it for, I think it's just Max actually. I was going to say other tools, but essentially you just select every object and set it to standard legacy and just click multiple for random material and it'll do all that for you. So there's no making clown passes yourself anymore. It's just click a button. So with these exported, which I've already done, we're going to go to Painter and we're going to make a new scene. And the file, we're going to use the low. We use 4K document resolution DirectX because I don't mind clicking flip Y in Marmoset, but it's also because it's Unreal's default normal normal channel directions. Compute tangent space per fragment. So the reason why I've got this on is because compute tangent space per fragment essentially is the computation in the fragment shader. It's also called the pixel shader. So when you've got this on, it'll compute the tangent space using the fragment shader, which means that it will work more synchronously with Unreal and other game engines, but not Unity. So Unity, this ticks off because it doesn't use pixel shaders to calculate its tangent space. It uses vertex to vertex interpolation. So if you're using Unity, you untick this. If you're using Unreal or any other game engine, you keep that on. Physical size. So my previous bakes, I got triangles being too small. This is a good place to fix that. So my mesh must be very small on the grand scale of scale. So I'm going to set the custom unit size to 1 unit equals 100 centimeters. And I'm going to discard so I can start again from this scene. So we've got this in here. We can click the bake mesh button. And I'm going to use 1024 for now with 32 padding. Because I'm baking at 4K, this padding size can go down. Diffusion can be a good thing. It's not always a good thing, but diffusion can decrease mipping at distance. So if your object is quite small or seen from a far distance, diffusion might be actually your friend. But I'm going to use 1024 for now. And the settings in common, I want to load in my high poly. I don't want to use a cage, but I will cover what a cage does because it can actually help when given objects with varying sizes and cavities and stuff. Max frontal distance. So I actually have a image here which shows non-average normals, but we can talk about this for average as well. So the frontal distance, the max frontal distance, and the max rear distance are defined here. So the green being the high poly, the red line being the virtual envelope, the frontal distance. It's kind of how a cage works as well, but without the splitting because you can split. Anyway, so the frontal distance, this distance comes out however far to encompass in the high poly. The rear distance encompasses how far the distance is from the low poly inward. So sometimes on the low poly, like the high poly will divot in. So if I can draw, so on the low poly, excuse my amazing drawing skills with my mouse. So you've got your low poly, and that's essentially just a square. And then you've got your high poly, which has got a square as well, but it's nice and rounded, for instance. But then on it, you've got like a hole that goes in, you know? Wow, that line was nice and straight. So you got this hole that goes in, and what that rear distance does is obviously the frontal distance goes up, so things that go bump up and all that kind of stuff get filled in, but then the rear distance are things that go down below the low poly surface, so this hole as well. So if you're getting issues with that, that's one way of fixing it. So we're going to set that as 0.1, 0.1 for now. And average normals, because you don't want to non-average normals. Match by mesh name, as defined earlier. I'm going to do no subsampling for now. Low, high, Ignorebf, all good. ID, material color, because I want the material color. The other ones, file ID, polygroup. They are other ways of getting color, but vertex color is just for Zbrush, polypaint. Mesh ID polygroup is for if you don't assign any colors. The issue is that if you've not done that, obviously, then it'll reassign all of those colors next time you rebake, which can be a real problem. Ambient occlusion, so ignore backface by mesh name. That is a thing that we want. Self-occlusion, always, because the mesh itself, it's all open right now. So I want ambient occlusion in the cavities of all the areas that are open. If this mesh had loads of moving parts, then I wouldn't want that to be using self-occlusion. I'd be wanting to use only mesh name, only by same mesh name. And it's because things that move will have the shadow of the AO baked into them. So say, for instance, this knife had to come apart from it. It means that a shadow from this edge here would be baked onto this knife, which would be not very good. So we got curvature, self-intersection, that's fine. Generated from mesh, yes. Position, I usually use one axis, B-box, and the up to down axis of painter, so y-axis, as you can see down here. Full scene. So that's just so I can get like where from the top down. Sometimes it's good to do all axis, especially for stuff like triplanar, because sometimes triplanar relies upon position. Thickness, I'm turning off because I don't need it for now. So with that done, let's do a test bake at 1024 resolution and see how that goes. So that's the test bake done. I just paused it briefly. So you can see you've got some aliasing along these edges here, which is fine for now because that can be fixed in super sampling and also in resolution, because we don't have enough resolution to hold some of these edges at this point because they're very sharp and tight. Same with the back edge here. You've got some, weird divoting going on. That's once again anti-aliasing. But it looks like our cage distances, our frontal and rear distances are actually pretty good for this. We're not getting many overlaps and issues in areas. A lot of this stuff, once again, is to do with aliasing, how tight the edges are. So what we can do is we can up this resolution. Let's just also check our ID by pressing B, M back to the material, bake mesh maps. Let's go up to 4K. We're going to change our dilation width down to 8 pixels because 4K is very, very big and we don't need that much dilation. So let's do that again. Okay, so that's finished baking. So you can see a lot of our aliasing issues have disappeared now. Still a few little ones, and that's to do with skewing. So unfortunately, Painter doesn't offer skew mapping like Marmoset does. But if we were to use a cage, we could possibly fix these errors, which I may possibly show. So that's all looking nice and hunky-dory. Let's look inside here. All good. Okay. So let's just have a flick through the maps. So you can see here, when I'm flipping through the maps, there was some lines that were popping up. They've disappeared now, but there was a black line that was appearing across here. That's aliasing in the viewport. You see it there. Let's do a UV splits and aliasing in the viewport. You can get around that by turning it on up here. Camera settings, I believe, or yeah, temporal aliasing. You go to 32 or something. So with that at 32, we'll see much crisper lines, which looks a lot nicer. So if we go to material by pressing M, let's talk about the ignore backfacing. So with this baked like this, if I go to my ambient occlusion, you can see that it's not causing any shadows, and that's the ignore backface, which is incredibly useful for floaters, but I've not really seen many people talk about it, so I'm going to yap on about it. So if I go to bake mesh and I turn off ignore backface, switch it to never from by mesh name, and then bake again, we'll very quickly see this is what usually you get from floaters. And so by using that ignore backface, you can get some nice, clean floating details without the effort of modeling them into geo. So you should really take consideration of using floaters because they can be such a lifesaver and such a speedy tool, and they provide just as good of a result. So with this then, we're going to talk about obviously the skewing back here. We can have a look at using a cage. So currently I don't have a cage, but I can go over how we can make a cage. So right now, these meshes here are overlapping each other in that way. So if I duplicate these, this is just a quick way of using cages. So we'll keep the extra letters it adds, move it to my default layer. And then in here for this, we're just going to do something as simple as a push modifier. So this is being applied to everything. And I want it to like 0, 0, 1. Very small amount. Just want to look at the high poly. So the point of this is I want to see through it. So currently my viewport is not doing a great job of seeing through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Object Properties, change the cancel the autosave, change this to by object, and okay, because I turned on transparency. So this is good. See, some of these are not too good, but most of them are pretty good for their cages, especially with the match by mesh name aspect of things. So some of these parts here, sometimes they skew a little bit. So luckily there's no skewing going on here. That's all good. So this part here, you can see doesn't come out far enough to touch the high poly out here, as you can see here. So this needs to not come out that far, but come out a little bit more. Enough that it covers it, but enough that it doesn't go crazy beyond its averaging. So the good thing with the cage is it allows you to adjust these things by minute values. So 2.4 just clips it, 2.5 encompasses it. You can also, with the cage, define things manually. So say for instance I'm getting some skewing and it's doing some weird things. I can come in here and grab edges and just move them and set my cage tangents. And that will work. So that's the benefit of using a cage for these things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to rename and I'm going to remove the last 4 or 3 digits. Yeah, 3 digits, because I want it to be named the same as my low poly. And then with that, I can export this as Spyderco low cage. And this is already triangulate, so I don't need to triangulate it. Smoothing groups, tangents, binaurals, preserve edge orientation. And then in Painter, I can use cage. Spyderco cage. You can see that it turned off average and relative to bounding box, as well as the max and rear distance. And the reason it's done that is because in the cage, you can split tangents. You can define whether it's average or non-average. You are the kind of creator and the person who defines that. And that's simply done by essentially taking edges, splitting them, disconnecting them, and that would be non-average, and then keeping them together is averaging them. So with that, we can try a bake with a normal again and see how broken we've made it. So we see now with the normals. So you're getting some aliasing here, but overall, not a bad result. It's within the cage. And this can be really useful for things like this. So you can see here, we've got some issues here with the cage. So if this was causing problems with using the frontal distance and the rear distance, the only way I can fix that is by adjusting the rear distance of the frontal distance. But the issue is then it affects everything. So in here, I can see there, I'm getting some pixel artifacts on these guys. So I can come into here. I've just currently got an X-ray mode, that's why it's doing that. And I can look at these guys, and I can see these are much bigger than I would like. So I'm going to come into this. I think this is affecting everything right now, so probably better to collapse this and do a push again. I use on a minus value, not 0.1, minus 0.01. So you can just look. I've also grabbed the high poly that I'm trying to do it to, which is bolts. Bolts high. Just grab them all. Isolate. Turn on bolts here, and then we can see here there's some little issues. So what I'm going to do with this one, because the push modifier was on all of them, I'm going to take the bolts from this guy, own it, move it back down to here. I think it's under the high poly yet. Actually, it's the default. Yeah, okay. Remove the suffix. I understand this is probably more long-winded than it needs to be. Whoops. For some reason it wasn't letting me rename it up there. So then use push with this guy. 0.1. Okay. That's too much. 0. For some reason I am not able to type here. Let's just do this. Fix it. Cancel autosave. For some reason my keyboard has decided to die on me. Still too much. Almost there, too little. That's a good amount. 0.05. Okay. And that works for all of these. Encompasses it all. A little bit of a problem there. So maybe 0.06. Okay, that's just the low poly mesh causing that. Yep, okay. So we can turn that high poly off. And these guys can be turned off as well. These are the guys that we want to keep. And we can turn all these guys back on. Turn off X-ray because I want to see what I'm doing. So this is the cage. Exporting the cage again. and don't triangulate because it's already triangulated. Gauge is already set up still, so we just rebake again. And you see it fixes our issue without subjugating all these other edges to the problem. So now to fix that aliasing, back in here, aliasing up to 4 super samples. Let's see what that's like. So 4K with 4 super samples, that's a pretty big map. So we don't want to do that unless you've got the RAM and the memory to deal with that. And you can see it fixed quite a few of the little errors. Go back to the material. It's nice and smooth. And baked down nicely. So that covers pretty much everything for this. The only thing would be skew maps, but skew maps are done in Designer, not Painter. So if you want to achieve like skew mapped results, so that's basically fixing errors to do with projected surface and the way that the normals look. Unfortunately, that can only really be done in Marmoset right now and Designer. But I don't think I will showcase that just because that's a kind of job in itself. So we'll leave it with this stuff, and if people want to see skew map stuff, we'll possibly cover it in Designer. Or by that time, you never know, maybe algorithmic, well not algorithmic, Adobe now, Adobe will have put skew map correction into Painter. Until that day though, you're going to have to do cages to fix that problem. Well, that's that. See ya.